Way back in April of 1882, a local gambler known only as Dutch Charlie was looking to stir up trouble in the tiny prairie town of Coulson, Montana. He marched into a local saloon and shouted out to everybody inside that he was the bully here in Coulson. The saloon's waiter, a young man named Frank Redmond, heard the declaration, stood up, and asked Dutch what the heck was going on with him. To which Dutch replied by punching him in the face and then whipping out his revolver and shooting him through the heart. Just like that. That's all it took, and poor Frank was dead. It's all right here in this 140-year-old Montana newspaper that I found. Pretty crazy stuff, right? Dutch Charlie would go on the run for 3 years before finally being caught out in Bozeman, Montana, while Frank Redmond was buried right here in Coulson's Boothill Cemtery, along with plenty more unfortunate folk, like, for example, Judge Edward Fawkes, who was hit by a train and killed in 1882, and William Stoltz, who died in what the newspapers only described as a drunken fit. And you know, none of these 3 men have headstones anymore. And in fact, there's 0 original headstones at all in this entire cemetery. The sole physical trace that anybody was ever buried here is the big monument placed at the top of the hill that's meant to memorialize everybody buried in the cemetery. But in a way, that's kind of fitting, because Boothill Cemtery was originally the burial place for the town of Coulson, Montana, right? And Coulson, Montana, nowadays, looks like this. Yeah, just a big field. Not one single shred of the town still exists. It dried up like a prune when the railroad shifted routes over to nearby Billings, Montana. But make no mistake, during its heyday back in the 1880s, Coulson, Montana made its mark on the American West. Notorious for drinking and gunfights, Coulson had no problem filling up its little cemetery during the years that the town was active. So today, I want to tell you about the people buried here, and more specifically, how they all ended up in the ground. How every one of them met their fate. Or at least, almost every one of them. But we'll get back to that later. For now, let's continue on our survey of Boothill Cemtery with Patrick Dwyer, whose death resulted from a very strange series of events. Patrick Dwyer was a railroad worker who once attended a party with some other railroad men back in the winter of 1882. Somehow, a big argument over beer ignited at the party, and Patrick got himself so worked up over it that he grabbed a shovel and started threatening to kill another one of the men. But Patrick got distracted when he noticed that another man named Jeremiah Coakley was barfing all over Patrick's bed. So Patrick promptly forgot about the whole beer argument and whipped out his revolver, demanding that Jeremiah stand up and march out into the street, with Patrick's revolver aimed squarely at his head. As Patrick marched his hostage out of the house and into the road, Jeremiah suddenly asked if Patrick would go back inside and grab his hat, which he, for some reason, agreed to do. He just left Jeremiah standing there and ran back into the house to grab the hat. And while Patrick was gone, Jeremiah whipped out his own gun, pointed at the doorway, and boom. As soon as Patrick reappeared, Jeremiah put 2 bullets in him. Patrick fell to the earth as dead as a doornail. A killing that would later be excused as self-defense on Jeremiah's part. Yet another shooting death here at Boot Hill. But you know, not all gunshot deaths in Coulson were intentional. A mail carrier named Billy Needham died when his revolver fell out of his pocket and went off when it hit the ground. Thomas Christie was killed in some kind of gun accident that I unfortunately couldn't find too much detail on. And somebody with the last name Smith was killed in a hunting accident of some sort. But perhaps the most tragic of all these accidental shooting deaths was the end of Billy Medham. Billy was a man from the East Coast who had gone on a series of trips out into the West. And at the end was supposed to be his very last trip. He jumped off the stagecoach, yelled out that he was headed back home in the morning, and tossed his gun onto the saloon bar, which promptly fired from the impact and shot poor Billy dead. Just a few more of those forgotten folks buried in these unmarked graves, which, by the way, was kind of by design. See, even back when Coulson was at its height, the residents never really bothered to carve any real headstones. They would just break a hunk of sandstone off the big cliffs watching over the cemetery and then plunk that rock into the ground as a makeshift grave marker. And now, 140 years later, all those sandstone markers have eroded away, meaning that it's up to you and me to remember people like Ed Preble, who climbed up to the very top of these cliffs and then downed a vial of poison, wasting away with a final view of the Yellowstone River Valley. Louisa Carter went out in a pretty similar way. She decided that she would rather walk into the Yellowstone River than face what must have been a crushing domestic dispute with her husband. Muggins Taylor was killed trying to confront a local outlaw. Apparently, the assailant waited for Muggins to get close to his house, propped his gun up on the door jamb, and then blam, shot him. And to rub salt into the wound, the killer's name was Henry Lump. William Preston was shot and murdered in 1882 when he tried to dissolve a business partnership with a man named Dan Leahy. Apparently Preston was very well liked in Coulson because it didn't take long for the town to start buzzing with talk of vigilante justice. In order to protect Leahy, the local marshal actually had to smuggle him away to another town under cover of darkness. There, Leahy was convicted of murder and then promptly poisoned himself in his cell. From what I've read, Leahy's last wish was to be buried in Boothill, a request that the people of Coulson refused to carry out. By the way, if all this gruesome talk is bumming you out, then just take a look at how the people of Coulson used to react to all these deaths. They basically made like a whole event out of it, almost a party. The gravediggers would all stand around the coffin and try to flick pennies into the slots between the wooden boards. Whoever had the worst aim was required to run back into town and pick up some beer for the funeral. But the festivities didn't even end there. After the burial, it was customary to hop on your horse and race back to the saloon as fast as you could, so you could get back to drinking ASAP. Apparently these races were so wild that one of the people buried in the cemetery here is an unnamed man who fell off his horse and died during the mad dash back to town. Pretty crazy, right? And he's not the only resident of Boot Hill to die falling off a horse either. Clarence Toplife was competing in a horse race when a dog ran in front of his path and caused his horse to buck him off to his death. By now, I'm sure you've noticed how the vast majority of these have been on the violent side, and that trend is gonna continue, with Ben Walker, who was shot to death by a man who also injured himself by forgetting to remove the ramrod from the gun that he shot Walker with. We have John Hart, who likely took his own life with a pistol. We have James Russell and George MacArthur, who got into a fist fight over a business debt that eventually ended with Russell shooting MacArthur to death. And hey, look at this. We've come to the coolest name in the entire cemetery, in my opinion at least. Sandbar Brown, who was killed along with the Barnes brothers in some kind of confrontation with Shoshone Native Americans. That name was just way too cool to die with him though, as he passed it on to who I can only assume is his son, Sandbar Brown II, a historian and lecturer here in Montana back in the 20s. Danny Smith was also killed in some kind of skirmish with Native Americans, this time from the Sioux tribe. And how about Louis Johnson, who followed A.E. Bell around with a gun, complaining that Bell owed him money until Bell got sick of it and shot him dead. And last but not least, the final burial we'll be talking about today, Dave Courier. Undoubtedly my favorite story of the bunch, and probably the only one in this entire video that can be considered even vaguely uplifting. But before I tell you that story, I should really quickly mention why I said that this video covers almost everybody buried in Boothill Cemtery. You see, besides the people that I have mentioned so far by name, there is very likely to be a whole host of other burials out here that just really can't be confirmed anymore. Like people whose names and stories have been lost to time. Like I've read a whole bunch of accounts about all sorts of other burials, like stories of mass graves of members of the Crow tribe who were killed by smallpox, or soldiers who drowned in the nearby Yellowstone River. But, you know, I decided early on when I was making this video that if I couldn't find a good citation location for a burial, then I wasn't going to mention it in the video. So in reality, there is quite likely to be several more bodies in the earth here besides those that we've talked about today. Plus, there were actually a few people buried here after the Coulson, Montana days and a few bodies that were moved here from other cemeteries, but I'm really only concerned with deaths that occurred while Coulson, Montana was still up and running. Which leads me to my final story, Dave Courier, a man who found himself on the wrong end of true love. You see, back in 1879, Dave set out to kill another man named John Alderson over a land dispute. So he went to the Alderson household where he found Mrs. Alderson all alone. Her husband wasn't home. Steaming mad, Dave told Mrs. Alderson that he was going to shoot and kill her husband as soon as he laid eyes on him. He demanded to know where Mr. Alderson was, and Mrs. Alderson, knowing that her husband was unarmed and completely unprepared for a fight at work, tried to trick Dave into staying at the house. Like she would rather this deranged man stay alone with her than send him off towards her husband. But the ruse didn't work, and Dave slunk off to go try and find and confront Mr. Alderson. A confrontation that would surely leave Mr. Alderson all full of holes. Luckily for him, though, his wife was a woman of action. She grabbed a rifle and snuck off behind Dave, following him into town, determined to protect her husband. So, once Dave found Mr. Alderson, he raised his revolver up to shoot him and then froze in his tracks. As Mrs. Alderson made herself known, drew a bead on him, and demanded that Dave quit pointing that weapon at her husband. Mr. Alderson, realizing the danger, walked over to his wife, grabbed the rifle out of her hand, and blasted Dave Courier dead, right then and there. As the shot was fired, Mrs. Alderson swooned and fell, having sustained her remarkable courage and determination until the danger was past. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you next time.